This is The Voice of Russia. The program is called Debating Russia, and my name is Dmitry Linden. The question for this show is, how is the United States trying to influence Russia? What are its aims, and what are its methods? With me in our London studio are Dr. William Shord, Program Leader, Politics and Global Studies at the University of Winchester. He's a specialist in contemporary American politics and political history. Charlie Wolf, American broadcaster and political commentator living in London. And over Skype from Moscow, Eric Kraus, director of the Moscow-based company Principal Asset Management, and a man with a keen interest in Russia-West relations. Thank you for taking part in the show. Now, the West, notably the United States, has been putting an enormous amount of pressure on Russia, most recently over Ukraine, of course, but it all began much earlier. In a recent interview, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, referring particularly to the sanctions, "Our partners," he said, "are not hiding the fact that the goal of these measures is not Ukraine. Essentially, in their statements and actions, the true purpose of the restrictions is evident, which is to alter Russia, to change its position on key issues which are of fundamental importance to us, that is, to Russia, and to get Russia to adopt the Western position." Now, what we're going to talk about today is what exactly Washington's goals are. Is it to bring some sort of positive change to Russia, which, in the view of the United States, is obviously not positive enough? Or is it to turn Russia into an outcast, to recast it as an evil empire, to mold Russia as the perfect enemy in order to serve its own political stratagem, which I hope we're going to unravel? Eric, what is your take on that? Is it a positive influence that the U.S. is trying to exert, or is that indeed sort of putting Russia in the dock kind of policy?
Well, positive for whom? The United States found that the Yeltsin regime of the 1990s was quite positive. They were singularly unchallenged by it. It was compliant and did not in any way interfere with their policy objectives. The fact that for Russian people it was an unmitigated disaster was unfortunate, was not, I don't believe, certainly was not willed by Washington, but they could live with that. Russians are living much better under the current government for all of its shortfallings, and like most governments, it has its shortfallings. But it is exceedingly popular in Russia, but it has been relatively assertive vis-a-vis the West. And Mr. Putin sees Russia as an independent actor with its own set of interests, goals, fears, strategies, and wishes to be taken as an equal, and thus far hasn't gotten what he wanted along those lines.
Dr. William Shord, your take on this same question. Is it a positive influence the U.S. is trying to exert?
Well, I think I'd like to. I think one of the problems is it's probably a misreading of the Russian geopolitical imperative, which is essentially defensive in orientation. So when we see things like what happens in Crimea and Ukraine, to much of American foreign policy thinking that's Russia being assertive, being expansionist, and being aggressive. So if you based it, it didn't become president, of course, but Mitt Romney in 2012 said that he sees Russia as America's number one geopolitical foe. So that's really setting out a very, very specific marker that Russia is not to be trusted, Russia cannot be engaged, it only understands strength, etc., etc. And I think a lot of that goes back 20 years to the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe and possibly into Georgia and Ukraine, which means there's not really a meeting of the minds in terms of Russia's understanding of how America sees Russia and vice versa. So that fundamentally seems to be a major problem. In the American position, it seems to me a misunderstanding or misreading, whether willful or otherwise, of what Russia really wants to have happen. Essentially, it is defensive in its attitudes, but it is seen as being aggressive.
Okay, Charlie Wolf, the notion of aggressive has popped up quite often lately, even before Ukraine, I would say.
Yeah, but I think Ukraine.
What word would you use?
Ukraine probably helped seal the deal as far as aggressive is concerned. I think it
seal the deal in the minds of certain, in a certain school of thought.
It's almost self-evident. It's not just, in the minds of different thoughts. But that said, I think it's fair to say that we have an administration right now that doesn't seem to know what it wants. In the beginning, of course, it was the famous reset button, which I think I can't remember.
Was it genuine? Was it genuine with Hillary Clinton?
To be fair, I think it probably was. But again, there was probably a misunderstanding. The whole foreign policy was misunderstood. I think there was a lot of this feeling of Obama's not George Bush. Obama's charismatic. All I have to do is go around and give a couple speeches.
And a smile.
And a smile, and that's how it works. And I look at Mr. Putin, and Mr. Putin is more of a politician and an operator, and he's in for Russia's self-interest, which is fair enough. All countries have self-interest. And as you know, there is no love lost between the two. So I see a combination of a slightly confused foreign policy from the United States. Okay. You look at the sanctions, which to me aren't strong enough. But that said, the fact that Mr. Lavrov is complaining means they must be doing something. They're having some sort of an effect. But even then,
do you think that's the only reason that Lavrov came back sort of quite strongly on this one?
Well, not necessarily the only reason, but I think it's a sign that they're probably having more effect than we thought they would. I'm surprised because I didn't think they were that effective. I would have gone much further. I would have gone maybe for sector-wide sanctions. But that said, they seem to be having some sort of an effect if Mr. Lavrov is voicing concerns.
Eric Krauss, watching the developments from inside Russia, how effective these sanctions are, would you say, and how effective, I guess, American influence has been sort of recently, at least?
Well, the sanctions have been modestly effective, but not as intended. They have caused major damage to European industry, and Russian economic growth, industrial production growth, in September was a positive almost 3%, largely due to import substitution and the very sharp fall in the ruble. So the sanctions are, I think, on the view on the ground, it's a mixed bag. They could be a net benefit. They could be net harmful to Russia, depending on certain decisions which will be made or not be made in the Kremlin. Russia has been revealed to be extremely vulnerable to Western sanctioning or blackmail, depending on how you want to look at it. The financial system in particular, the payment system, the credit card system, they're rushing to create alternatives to link up with the Chinese payment system in particular, so as not to be held to ransom for geopolitical goals. The situation on the ground in Russia is largely unchanged. The food stores are about as stocked as they ever were. I can't get my favorite Finnish cottage cheese, but there are lots of Russian alternatives which have now been created. So the sanctions thus far are a nuisance or an irritant, and it shows an extreme hostility. I mean, ordinarily, countries will not be openly attempting to damage each other's economic interests, and this creates a break which is not going to be healed.
Moving on slightly, we, of course, all remember Victoria Nuland's statement to the effect that the U.S. has spent $5 billion on democratic change in Ukraine. Do we know anything about whether a similar sort of course of action, a similar or perhaps larger sums of money have been channeled into Russia to stimulate some sort of democratic change in the U.S. eyes there?
I can't speak to that. I'm not familiar with that. But then again, I think Ukraine is the issue. I think Russia is in a position where democratic change could be accomplished without mass sums of money. I think if you look at issues of human rights, of journalists who've been arrested,
excuse me, let me get that straight. So democratic change in Ukraine, do you consider it as that, the events unfolding in Ukraine in the past half a year?
Well, I think what's important is the fact of Russia's presence in Ukraine, and I think that's where the United States is worried, and that's why that's what the sanctions are all about. There is evidence that Russia has been participating in Ukraine, and the United States is probably looking upon this, and not happily so, nor is Europe, and especially the Ukrainians are not happy about this.
Nuland came up with a figure of $5 billion before any assertions, any claims to the effect that Russia was sort of heavily involved or had a finger in the pie. Dr. Sheward, yes?
I think the conventional thing with America in the past, with this sort of, I suppose, what the government is aimed at might see as destabilizing, is to funnel money to democratic groups or to dissident groups of that nature, sometimes military. Clearly, this isn't likely to be the case in this instance. I don't see any evidence that's being done, at least not overtly. I think there's certainly made it very clear in Ukraine who is being supported. The weakness of the American position is, and Russia knows this very well, is that what can they do militarily? What can they do in terms of countervailing power to influence the Russian position? So one thing which might have an influence looking forward in the future, based upon what Joe Biden said when he gave the speech to the Georgia Parliament several years ago, he said Russia's a dying power, the population is decreasing. And in
is
future,
that the school of thought the others chip into?
It's in the sense that we deal with this as much as we can in difficult circumstances, but knowing in time that Russia becomes less and less significant. But of course, that's in the future, and it may not actually take place anyway. So the other countervailing power, which is difficult to manipulate, would have an impact upon Russia, is of course what Russia has, which is natural gas and oil. And clearly Russian concerns about decline in the price of oil, and does have an impact on Russian policy. Now, can you manipulate that? That's very difficult to see how you do that, because it affects everybody, of course. And it's extremely difficult to manipulate world oil markets, for example. But that's the sort of thing which you'd have to think about if you're going to change policy. I mean, what powers have you got? What implement can you use to make a difference?
I think one of the problems...
yes, Eric, do come in.
The likelihood of anyone durably changing Russian policy from without is nil. It has been attempted.
You agree with that, yeah?
Oh, yeah, yes. No, listen, like I said, there's human rights problems in Russia I'd love to see change, but I don't see that as a... I don't necessarily see the mechanism of how one would do that.
Yes, Eric, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, there are human rights problems in most countries I could think of. If you look at the American system of criminal justice, which is arguably based largely on blackmail, otherwise known as plea bargaining, I think there are problems there, and there are problems in my native France, which has been going from bad to worse, and there are problems in Russia. I don't think those problems can be solved from outside. The Russians will have to solve their own problems, and the time when they were looking to America for assistance, which is basically the 90s, and which did not end well, whoever is to blame is not relevant, it didn't end well, is gone. Now, the Americans have been attempting to bring about regime change in Russia with their typical dexterity. Mr. McFaul was finally, the former U.S. ambassador, was finally pulled out after antagonizing pretty much everyone, including the Russian opposition. And so they haven't been terribly effective. And certainly, I don't think it's arguable that the effect of the sanctioning and the aggressive discourse towards Russia has been to consolidate Mr. Putin's power. He is now extremely popular. And of course, it's had another effect, which no one has mentioned yet, which is there is, according to the polls, one country where Mr. Putin is more popular than Russia, and that is the People's Republic of China, where he has a 92% popularity rating as opposed to 86% in Russia. The outcome of the policy has been to drive Russia far closer to China, which is a goal which has eluded Russian and Chinese policymakers for 20 years.
I think one of the problems, again, looking at this as an American and obviously as a partisan, as a Republican, with a Democrat, not even so much a Democrat, but with this Democrat in charge, foreign policy has not been his strong suite, to say the least. And, you know, there's an old saying about America's power in the world, and the world becomes a freer place when America is strong, is a general feeling. And when America is weak, is a general belief. And I think, I think if you look during the Reagan administration, I think that would prove that assumption. But we've seen with Mr. Obama in power, and again with a foreign policy that does seem to be all over the place. You look to the Middle East, Syria in particular, you look even to Israel and Palestine, etc. We see where this lack of leadership, again, this is a president who talks about leading from behind, not taking a forward position on the world stage. And again, that doesn't mean you're necessarily putting armies and boots on the ground in every part of the world and starting wars and what have you, but there seems to be a lack of a strength of position, and that allows, understandably, someone like a Mr. Putin to take advantage of that.
I think this is where we've got a problem with American foreign policy. It is conflicted. And so you get language like Biden used about, very much in contrast to what George Bush said about Putin. I've looked into his soul and I see someone I can work with. Biden says, I looked into Seoul and I see evil. So if you get that kind of very blatant language, how helpful is that? How much is that, though, done for audiences back in America? Is this just the sort of language that you kind of gloss over because you sort of think, well, that's part of the game we're all playing? But also at the same time as that kind of very idealistic language, these are regimes which we don't like. We want to at least see some change. We want to see some influence there. At the same time, you've got Obama's foreign policy effectively being, at the moment, trying to not do stupid stuff, as he said. So if you're going to do stupid
which
stuff...
Which is not asking much.
Which is not asking much.
But
so
it appears quite insurmountable, isn't it?
Indeed. So I think that's really a problem. Is the policy fundamentally realistic? Or is it looking towards what Americans expect out of their foreign policy? This is the kind of idealistic language, rather than the language of pragmatism or the language of, perhaps Europeans might say, cynicism, seeing things as they actually are. Doesn't really play that well to American audiences, not always engaged in foreign policy, which expects there to be values behind their foreign policy.
Gentlemen, I would like to take exception with the notion that when America is strong, the world is free. I mean, as a general proposition, if I were Vietnamese or Lao or Cambodian or
Iraqi or Afghani or
Guatemalan or Iraqi, I might feel differently. The situation of having a single global hegemon is, I think, in theory, relatively dangerous because countries, and I'm not asserting the U.S. is uniquely evil by any stretch of the imagination, but countries in general will act in what they perceive as their own self-interests. And those self-interests may not be those of countries which fall under their sway.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. The program is called Debating Russia. My name is Dmitry Linnik, and with me in the studio are Dr. William Sheward, a specialist in contemporary American politics and political history at the University of Winchester, Charlie Wolf, American broadcaster and political commentator in London, and over Skype from Moscow, Eric Kraus, director of the Moscow-based company Principal Asset Management. Eric, you brought up the issue of influence on public opinion. In that connection, there's in Henry Kissinger's new book called World Order, he stipulates that any system of world order to be sustainable must be accepted not only by leaders, but also by citizens. Is there evidence that this is happening in Russia, to start?
Well, certainly the current U.S. policy is not popular in Russia. There is a natural rally round the flag impulse, which you're going to have in any country. And I would say the Western influence is declining. What we're seeing now is a slow but substantial increase in the perceptions that China is the rising power and that we had best look eastward, not, of course, only to China, but to Korea, to Vietnam, where I'm working at present, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. So what you have in Russia is a split. You have a small liberal intelligentsia, which was heavily beholden to Washington. Some of it very much remains so. Some of it is now feeling sort of orphaned. You saw Mr. Navalny said that if he came to power...
That's the sort of one of the main Russian opposition leaders, Alexei Navalny.
Yes, he is, and he has been very close. He was funded by NED, National Endowment for Democracy. He was very close to Washington. Well, he just came out and said that if he came to power, which of course he won't, Crimea would remain Russian. So they are now feeling, I would say, more conflicted. And then you have the immense mass of the Russian populace, which is somehow relatively patriotic, which believes in Russian values, whatever they may be, and some of which looks back to the old days of the Soviet Union as a period of stability, of tranquility, of predictability. So I would not say that anyone has won any PR battles on the ground in Moscow.
Dr. William Sheward, in Europe, is there a split in public opinion vis-a-vis the whole sort of relationship with Russia?
I'm not sure I can speak about Europe, but certainly in terms of the United States, public opinion on foreign policy is very much like the sort of squirrel going after the next nut, really. It goes from one thing to the next very, very quickly, and at the moment it's all ISIS all the time. Back in the summer, of course, it was all about Ukraine. So that makes it very difficult to focus public opinion, which is really unfocused at the best of times on foreign policy, unless there's a clear US interest involved. So at the moment, we're going through one of those moments we've got sort of, I think, a trough there for an awareness of what's going on. Of course, ever since the summer, the events in Ukraine have continued, but they haven't continued as far as the American public is concerned, whose attention has been shifted somewhere else, which it makes it very difficult for any president to focus things back to what would be seen to be important. It's like sort of juggling sort of several plates at the same time, and unfortunately, several of those plates tend to crash.
Well, we've heard a few times.
Can I just follow up on
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
One of the problems, again, also is, and I feel very strange sitting here on the Voice of Russia excoriating my own president, even though he's of another party. So I hope they'll forgive me. But this does also go down to leadership. One of the great arguments has been on certain campaigns. You look at ISIS, and you have a president who's talking about what he's not going to do as to boots on the ground. And yes, it's a fair point to say that America is war-weary right now and would not want to see boots on the ground, but it is the job of a leader, of a Ronald Reagan, for instance, to convince people what you need to do and to lead the people. And unfortunately, we do have a president who at times seems disinterested, and in foreign policy especially. This is a man that's more interested in pushing Obamacare and the war on women and minimum wage and what have you. So it's not his strong suit to begin with, but there is this lack of leadership, and that's what's causing a lot of these problems.
So it's down to personalities or to parties in the States?
I don't know if it's necessarily personalities, but it is down to leadership. Again, if you look back even to George Bush, whether you agree or disagree with his policy, he sold it continually. He talked about his freedom agenda and why he was going into Iraq and what he was doing in Afghanistan. He owned it.
This is the point.
Okay.
This is, the Pied Piper was a great leader. He was followed by droves off a cliff edge. Leadership is a wonderful thing if you're leading in the right direction. Mr. Bush created ISIS. They basically destabilized the, in some ways, disagreeable regimes, but secular regimes of Syria, of Iraq, of Libya. And now what you're getting is a power vacuum into which the worst forces are flowing in. Now, I'm afraid they've done very much the same thing in Ukraine. You basically have got a government of oligarchs backed by a small but militant faction of fascists. And I'm using the term advisedly, and I don't think they'd object to my use of that term, which has just been shown in the pages of the New York Times to be using cluster munitions against its own people. This may be a failure of leadership, but I think it's more a failure of diplomacy and of direction.
Maybe of just a general direction, of general sort of ideals that you pursue. If as a result of your actions, regimes don't get more democratic, but do get vile and merciless and whatnot, then what is the point of your leadership?
I think one of the problems here is that the world has changed so fundamentally since, Charlie mentioned, going back to Ronald Reagan. There's an article written in 1990 by John Mearsheimer, an international relations scholar, saying why we will miss the Cold War. And people thought it was a very strange thing to say at the moment. We're about to win the Cold War. Why would we miss it? Because it made things remarkably easy and straightforward from Russia, for American foreign policy. If you saw what you perceived to be a communist movement anywhere in the world, you'd rush to knock it on the head. Policy has become much more complicated. So I think leadership becomes more complicated as a consequence. I think it's certainly true in the case of Obama. Foreign policy is not what he wanted to get involved in as president. He wanted to end the wars in Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq, and now, of course, foreign policy carries on, and you have to deal with it, as well as, of course, those issues which you wanted to get away from have come back or have never gone away in Afghanistan and Iraq, as we're seeing very clearly here. So it means there's very little bandwidth for a more nuanced discussion of what Russian policy should be.
Can I just make a point? Forgive me, but just to answer our other guest, the creation of ISIS, as I've seen it, isn't because of the destabilizing of George Bush. It was, in actual fact, the vacuum
destabilizing of George Bush,
by George Bush, forgive me, with vis-a-vis Iraq. But more so, that was essentially stabilized when Mr. Obama came to power. Obama himself admitted to this. What has brought around ISIS and a lot of the problems, again, has been this sign of weakness. And specifically, as far as Iraq is concerned, we should have had a status of forces agreement. After, again, agree or disagree with Iraq, after spending that amount of money and treasure and what have you, you want to protect what you've gained. And unfortunately, pulling all troops out and trying to lead by ideology is what allowed ISIS to grow.
So you sorry, Eric. So you, Charlie, do not doubt the principle of American leadership. You just question the quality of that leadership. Do we agree with that?
I think that America has a very important place in the world, and it has been founded on being a beacon of liberty, if you allow me to flag wave just for a moment. And and it's more than flag waving. It is a serious concept. We don't always get it right. But again, I think that there needs to be leadership in the world because it otherwise creates vacuums, and bad actors will fill vacuums.
Okay.
I think ISIS
Eric,
is an example of that.
How do you read that? It would seem to me that further down the line we get, the less enamored Russia is with that prospect or that practice, the U.S. leadership, global dominance, if you will.
Of course. I mean, any country which becomes the global hegemon concentrates the fire of everyone else. It is not a stable situation. We are moving towards a multipolar world, whether this pleases Washington or not. And they're becoming very irritable when they see their power flaunted. Certainly the situation with Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. Now,
we're talking about 2008.
Clearly now part of Russia and is not going back, is creating irritation. Now, what I think is interesting is this discussion. We have discussed American policy. I thought it was Western policy. And the West used to be comprised of many actors. As I said, I'm a French national, and I'm pretty distressed by the quality of governance in my own country right now. I can assure our American guests that they have nothing to envy us with the quality of Mr. Hollande. The problem is that you've had European diplomacy has been hijacked. And whereas a few years ago, the Europeans did tend to look out for their own interests, they've now been frog-marched into this impossible position where there is no solution. The amount of money it is going to take to rescue Ukraine is enormous. And the Americans gave them a very kind $52 million. Well, what they need is something, a few $100 billion. Yeah. Where is that money going to come from?
I want to turn our conversation in a slightly sort of different direction, perhaps. President Obama recently described Russia memorably as a regional power, which was certainly meant as a snub. There's been for a long time talk from Western politicians and commentators aimed at downgrading Russia's status, to expel it from the G8, to expel it, well, there was talk about expelling it from the G20. Certainly, there's been talk about expelling Russia from the UN Security Council. I mean, it's not a great power. Let's get rid of it. So all that started long before Ukraine, of course. Certainly in 91, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was left sort of on the ruins. Now, what we're hearing from Hillary Clinton now is pretty much the same tune. Yet on every major issue that the West, the world, dominated by the U.S. confronts, Russia is somehow, it has to be brought in, be it, the wider Middle East, Syria most prominently recently, Iran definitely, now Ukraine. There's no resolving the Ukraine situation without constructively engaging Russia. Do we agree on that?
I think one thing you have to take note of, at least as far as the United States and as far as Hillary Clinton is concerned, remember we have an election coming up in 2 years' time.
So is that for a domestic audience, you're saying?
Well, I think to an extent. Obviously, Hillary Clinton is now in a modus operandi of being the non-Obama, of separating herself from Obama and that administration.
And burning the bridges, yes.
And burning, well, not so much burning the bridges, but I think Mr. Obama's competence, his competence levels are very low right now. And even in the midterm elections, which are happening soon, it'll be interesting to see. There's a lot of Democrats that are trying to stay clear of Mr. Obama for the moment. So one has to look at rhetoric, whether it's from Hillary Clinton or from Mr. Lavrov. I think, going back to the speech we were referencing earlier, this was on Russia's NTV channel, and I think that, again, was probably more towards a domestic audience than anything else.
Yes, Dr. Sheward.
The reference to that concept as Russia as a regional power, I mean, clearly it's not a superpower. We're not back during the Cold War days. Russia doesn't have that international presence and the sense of the language of being an existential threat. It still, of course, is a nuclear power, so it's serious from that perspective. But it has to be, I think, as you pointed out, it has to be taken seriously because it is involved in areas where America has concerns. Even with things like Afghanistan and supply lines into Afghanistan rather than going through Pakistan, which is much more problematic. So America knows in many ways to solve these problems, you have to use Russia. The problem is in domestic politics.
To use Russia. Is that your choice of the word?
Use may be the wrong sort of impression, or at least to involve Russia. That it's not manipulative in that sense. I think it's just realistic. That's in the nature of diplomacy. Yeah. It's hard for domestic audiences, I think, to then, if you've been told that Putin is evil, as Biden said, if you've been told all these things in the past about the nature of Russian society, how alien it is to American society, then say, actually, we're working with these people after all. There was a good article in the Guardian yesterday by John Gray talking about the nature of evil and should we work with evil when it's necessary. That seems a very sort of cynical view, rather like in World War II when you had to work with Stalin against Hitler because he was worse than Hitler.
So is that the Guardian writer is suggesting that Russia is evil and we all agree on that?
No, he's making the point, the problem of using those binary terms and misunderstanding those binary terms, but it's something which, if you're presenting it to a public, it's very easy to understand on those terms. And American foreign policy has used
politics.
Has used it over the years, has said, here's a way of demonizing individuals, and you focused upon if it's a Saddam Hussein or a Gaddafi or a Stalin going back further or a Hitler. It's very easy, therefore, to understand those sorts of things. And then all of a sudden you might have to work with those people. Then there's a concern about, well, what's happened to our morality, our sense of values as a significant part of our foreign policy. And effectively, politics is real politics. You have to deal with what's there, but that's very difficult to do once you've actually said there's evil, and as Cheney said, we don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it.
There's quite a school of thought in Russia. There's quite a sort of wide support for the notion that America is inherently evil and aggressive and whatnot. So do you accord the Russian, that section of the Russian population the right to think of America that way? Charlie?
No.
Not
at all.
Okay. Yes, Eric.
Educated adult Russian will speak in those terms. This seems to be the appanage of Washington, where the political discourse has been dumbed down to quite a striking degree.
Oh, that's a
Russians
great point.
see a power struggle between America and this part of the world, and they are now beginning to align themselves. They're looking to the BRICS. They're looking for a multipolar alignment against the U.S. Nobody calls them evil because they serve their own interests, but nobody also believes that they're uniquely good or exceptional or destined to lead.
I think that's a good point to end this discussion. With me in the Voice of Russia's London studio were Dr. William Sheward of University of Winchester, a specialist in contemporary American politics and political history, Charlie Wolf, American broadcaster and political commentator in London, and over Skype from Moscow, Eric Krauss, director at the Moscow-based company Principal Asset Management.
you know, 20 years to the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe and possibly into Georgia and Ukraine, which means there's not really a meeting of the minds in terms of Russia's understanding of how America sees Russia and vice versa. So that fundamentally seems to be a major problem. In the American position, it seems to me a misunderstanding or misreading, whether willful or otherwise, of what Russia really wants to have happen. Essentially, it is defensive in its attitudes, but it is seen as being aggressive.
Okay, Charlie Wolf, the notion of aggressive has popped up quite often lately, even before Ukraine, I would say.
Yeah, but I think Ukraine.
Yeah?
I think Ukraine.
What word would you use?
Ukraine probably helped seal the deal as far as aggressive is concerned. I think it
seal the deal in the minds of certain in a certain school of thought.
It's almost self-evident. It's not just in the minds of different thoughts. But that said, I think it's fair to say that we have an administration right now that doesn't seem to know what it wants. In the beginning, of course, it was the famous reset button, which
West and Mr. Putin sees Russia as an independent actor. With its own set of interests, goals, fears, strategies, and wishes to be taken as an equal, and thus far hasn't gotten what he wanted along those lines.
Dr. William Sheward, your take on this same question. Is it a positive influence the U.S. is trying to exert?
Well, I think I'd like to. I think one of the problems is it's probably a misreading of the Russian geopolitical imperative, which is essentially defensive in orientation. So when We see things like what happens in Crimea and Ukraine to much of American foreign policy thinking that's Russia being assertive, being expansionist, and being aggressive. So if you based it, he didn't become president, of course, but Mitt Romney in 2012 said that he sees Russia as America's number one geopolitical foe. So that's really setting out a very, very specific marker that Russia is not to be trusted, Russia cannot be engaged, it only understands strength, etc., etc. And I think a lot of that goes back.
This is The Voice of Russia. The program is called Debating Russia, and my name is Dmitry Linden. The question for this show is, how is the United States trying to influence Russia? What are its aims, and what are its methods? With me in our London studio are Dr. William Shord, Program Leader, Politics and Global Studies at the University of Winchester. He's a specialist in contemporary American politics and political history. Charlie Wolf, American broadcaster and political commentator living in London. And over Skype from Moscow, Eric Kraus, director of the Moscow-based company Principal Asset Management, and a man with a keen interest in Russia-West relations. Thank you for taking part in the show. Now, the West, notably the United States, has been putting an enormous amount of pressure on Russia, most recently over Ukraine, of course, but it all began much earlier. In a recent interview, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, referring particularly to the sanctions, "Our partners," he said, "are not hiding the fact that the goal of these measures is not Ukraine. Essentially, in their statements and actions, the true purpose of the restrictions is evident, which is to alter Russia, to change its position on key issues which are of fundamental importance to us, that is, to Russia, and to get Russia to adopt the Western position." Now, what we're going to talk about today is what exactly Washington's goals are. Is it to bring some sort of positive change to Russia, which, in the view of the United States, is obviously not positive enough? Or is it to turn Russia into an outcast, to recast it as an evil empire, to mold Russia as the perfect enemy in order to serve its own political stratagem, which I hope we're going to unravel? Eric, what is your take on that? Is it a positive influence that the U.S. is trying to exert, or is that indeed sort of putting Russia in the dock kind of policy?
Well, positive for whom? The United States found that the Yeltsin regime of the 1990s was quite positive. They were singularly unchallenged by it. It was compliant and did not in any way interfere with their policy objectives. The fact that for Russian people it was an unmitigated disaster was unfortunate, was not, I don't believe, certainly was not willed by Washington, but they could live with that. Russians are living much better under the current government for all of its shortfallings, and like most governments, it has its shortfallings. But it is exceedingly popular in Russia, but it has been relatively assertive vis-a-vis the